Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with a Scientist. I'm Leah from Headwaters Science Institute. Today, we're going to meet another wonderful scientist who is in the Ph.D. program at the University of Nevada, Reno. But before we get into that, I wanted to thank a longtime sponsor of Headwaters programs who has been helping us out since the inception of Headwaters. The Villager Nursery in Truckee, California is a wonderful community asset. If you live around the area, please check them out. You know, it's wintertime right now, but they've got everything you need, from houseplant care to garden and large tree care in the summer, everything in between, a wonderful selection of gifts and other options. So check out the Villager Nursery in Truckee, California. Eric LaRusin, thank you so much for your support. It helps us keep programs like this free to our students. So today I am excited to introduce Katie Strain. Katie is a plant ecologist and Ph.D. student at the University of Nevada, Reno, and her research interests lie at the intersection of invasion ecology, disturbance ecology, and conservation. She's interested in understanding how disturbances such as wildfires, species invasion, and climate change influence plant community assembly within an ecosystem. And today, she's going to specifically talk to us about her work studying grass. So for centuries, grass has been transported around the globe. And today, we're going to find out the ecological impacts of two non-native invasive grasses. And we'll hear more about what that means. So I am very excited to welcome Katie Strain. Hi, Katie.
Hi, great to be here.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to get into your talk. But before that, I wanted to ask you, of course, you're a student at UNR, which is in the high desert. So how do you end up in the desert studying grass?
Yeah, so before I lived in Reno, I lived in Austin, Texas. And I was becoming a plant ecologist and getting into the world of grasses. And when you learn about invasive species, there's a classic example, cheatgrass, which we'll talk a little bit about today, that is this classic example. It's almost the poster child for a really difficult invasive species problem. And so when I first heard about that, I was like very fascinated. And I kind of knew that I always wanted to maybe work on that, but I did end up finagling my way up here and being able to work on this really interesting ecological problem that I'm excited to talk about today.
Cool. Well, we're very excited. So I'll pull up your presentation and I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Strain, and I'll be talking to you today about how plant invaders alter their ecosystems. Just a little bit about myself and how I got to be here. My name is Katie, and I'm a plant ecologist, which means I study how plants interact with one another and their environment. I received my bachelor's in science in environmental science at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm currently a PhD student in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology at the University of Nevada, Reno. This is the tree of life. Represented here are 8.7 million species. You are one of 7.8 billion individuals of a single species. And you know that you matter as an individual. But what about the rest of the 8.7 million species on this tree? How do we determine the value of a species? By its usefulness to humans, like the sheepdog, or maybe by its aesthetic value, like these tulip rose in Denmark? What about a wasp? They have little value to humans at first glance, but their role as a predator control lots of agricultural pests. We can all agree that bees have value as pollinators, but did you know that wasps are also pollinators? In fact, without one wasp species, fig trees can't reproduce because they rely on wasps to be pollinated. Without them, we wouldn't have figs. Though wasps at the surface don't seem to have direct value to humans, their role in the ecosystem is important, and they help support healthy and functioning communities. What about this species? This is yellow pygmy poppy. It lives in the desert, mostly in a lonely way by itself. It doesn't grow in large amounts, has little economic value, and it doesn't play a particularly large role in the ecosystem. Should we care about this species? If it disappeared tomorrow, how many of us would miss it? I've defined many of the previous species in terms of their utility to people. Many ecologists argue that a species has intrinsic value, or value outside of their role in an ecosystem or their value to humans. That is, these species count, whether or not there is anyone to do the counting. They say, if humans have inherent worth, if we deserve to be here, then so does every other species. But okay, what if you don't buy it? Why should we care about all the other species or species diversity on the globe? Biodiversity can be defined in many ways, but let's consider the number of species on the globe. When we lose out on biodiversity, what are we missing out on? We're missing out on recreation and aesthetic value. No one wants to walk around in cornfields. That's much more boring than forests and grasslands or botanical gardens. Many medicines are developed from plants, microbes, and fungi, like penicillin. Anti-cancer properties have been discovered in a periwinkle that lives deep in the forests of Madagascar. Many of the species on this planet haven't been valued for medicinal reasons, but species like this periwinkle are often at risk for loss when we don't care for biodiversity. We may be losing the cure to diseases without knowing they even existed in the first place. Of those 8.7 million species I mentioned earlier, nearly a third are at risk for extinction. Human activities are resulting in rapid loss of biodiversity globally. We lose species through loss of habitat, when habitat is replaced by agriculture or urban land. We lose them through the direct exploitation of organisms. Dodos are no longer around due to being hunted to extinction by humans. The adverse impacts of climate change threaten species. Imagine a hungry polar bear struggling to hunt on disappearing sea ice. And species struggle to survive in polluted environments. Turtles consume plastics that appear to them as jellyfish. But today we'll focus on this final point. Globally, species are threatened by invasive species transported both purposefully and accidentally around the globe by human activity. Let's define an invasive species. An invasive species is a species that is not native, meaning it's not traditionally part of an ecosystem. It maintains self-sustaining populations, means that not only if I plant it here and I water it, but if I accidentally release it into the ecosystem, it can reproduce and spread around the landscape. And finally, invasive species cause economic or environmental harm. On the right, we have kudzu, which is an invasive vine just crawling over an entire ecosystem. Imagine that you're a tree under this blanket of vine. How are you supposed to get enough light to photosynthesize? You can see for scale a car in the bottom right of this photo. Not all non-native species become invasive. I have a Christmas cactus on my desk, which is originally from the coastal forests of Brazil, and I don't worry about it invading the high desert of the Great Basin. Your parents' pansies in their front yard are unlikely to cause ecological damage. So there are 3 ingredients to a successful species invasion. How aggressive is the species? Is it a voracious eater, or can it live in a lot of places? Another factor is how vulnerable the ecosystem is. Is there an open niche for the species? Are there any organisms that would eat it? And finally, how often is it introduced? Can it increase the probability that a species... How often is it introduced, and how many are introduced when it is introduced? This can increase the probability that a species will be successful because there are more on the landscape. Let's take a look at an example of one of my favorite invasive species, the lionfish. Now, I'm a plant ecologist, but I love to talk about the lionfish as an example of an invasive species. These animals are crazy, amazing monsters. They have no natural predators in their introduced range because of their venomous spines. They can live in anywhere from 6 feet of shallow reefs to 600 feet of water. They eat more than 40 species of fish, including economically important species like red snapper. They have been known to eat entire reefs of fish. Furthermore, a lionfish can reproduce every 4 days. In fact, a single female can have 2 million offspring in a single year. New lionfish are dumped into the Atlantic every day from aquariums in which the owner was stung, or maybe they ate all the fish. I love the lionfish because it's a great example of the 3 qualities that really make a good invasive species. It causes massive economic damage to commercial fishing, as well as environmental damage to reef ecosystems. And where I'm from, in the Texas Gulf, lionfish are so problematic that they've considered introducing lionfish derbies, where you can go out and spear gun lionfish, and the number one catcher of these lionfish wins a prize. I hope one day to get my spear gun license. But let's talk about grass. They may not have eyeballs or venomous spines, but I think you can be surprised by how grasses change their environment. The grass family is one of the most economically important plant families. For centuries, humans have relied on grasses like oats, sugar, rice, and corn as a staple and base of their diet. Not only do humans rely on grasses for food, but much of our livestock relies on grasses for food. For these reasons, humans have cultivated and transported grass around the globe for centuries. Humans introduce grasses for a few reasons besides our front lawns. We introduce them for food, to feed our food, because they're beautiful, or sometimes we import them accidentally. Today I'm going to talk about when grass introduction goes wrong, and when an introduced grass becomes invasive and takes over an ecosystem. And in fact, this can have extreme consequences. Now, all of these grasses are non-native to North America, but only 2 are invasive. That is, they cause harm to their ecosystems. And I want to talk about those 2 today. Now, we are moving into my area of research. I'm going to talk about 2 ways that grass invaders impact their ecosystems. Invasive grasses have many approaches to invasion, but today we're going to look closely at these 2 grasses and what makes them a successful invader. We'll look at Bahia grass, in which humans select for traits that give it a competitive advantage. And we'll look at cheatgrass, which builds an environment to suit itself. This is Bahia grass, introduced on purpose from South America and bred for feeding livestock. When you're breeding grasses for livestock, you're selecting for certain traits. So let's take a look at what kind of traits you may be selecting for. Imagine you're a farmer or a rancher. When you're selecting a grass to feed your cattle, what's the ideal grass? Something that you can seed once and will continue to come back year after year, that can fight off other plants so that you have a field of grass and not a field of mixed plants, and that is tasty and juicy for your cattle, right? Well, if you recall your traits that make a species a good invader, these are them in disguise. You're selecting for an aggressive invader because you want your grass to produce lots of seeds and be good at fighting off other plants. In short, I'm selecting for the same traits that would make this a good invasive species. Furthermore, planted grasses are often introduced into an ecosystem multiple times, since many farmers or ranchers may decide that a grass like Bahia grass is perfect for their cattle. We are setting the stage for a potential invasion. In the case of Bahia grass, it can reproduce both by seed, sexually, or asexually, by clones. It's a beefy grass, and it grows very densely, and I've literally seen it cleave a native grass in half with its body. Bahia grass is what we call stoloniferous. Have you ever pulled up a grass in your yard and it comes like it comes up like tick, 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 tick? Those are stolons. This is a way that grasses can grow, where each little clump of grass or a tiller is a shoot that is propagated from the parent. On the left here is a single tiller of Bahia grass, and on the right is a group of tillers connected by these really thick purple stolons. Bahia grass grows these stolons very densely, which makes it difficult for other things to grow in between. It can change an area from something on the left, a native grassland with lots of flowering plants and maybe some limited bare ground, to what you see on the right, which is basically a lawn. And if you pull back all of these leaves, you can see lines and lines of these little purple worm-like stolons crowding the soil surface. We surveyed 6 Texas counties looking for non-native invasive species to understand how invasive species are operating in this region of Texas. Are they different than in other regions of Texas? Much of this area of Texas is privately owned, and not much is known about the current ecology of the region. The way we collected our data is through a plot. We had a circular plot seen above, and up to 16 random locations on the property that we generated beforehand. In each plot, we identified all of the species present and counted the number of grass tillers. We did this for 15 properties across the 6 counties. And what we found kind of surprised us. Bahia grass not only was common on the landscape, meaning it was found on a lot of sites, but it was often abundant, appearing in high amounts and often in more than 10% of our plots. It may not have always occurred on our plots, but we did observe it in every single site that we went to. In fact, compared to other known non-native invasive grasses, it was most common. KR bluestem, pictured here second on this chart, is a known invasive species in central Texas, and we were surprised to find that Bahia grass was more common than this known invader. In plots that had any Bahia grass, total biodiversity as well as grass diversity decreased by roughly a third. Significantly here means that we've collected enough data to determine that this is not due to chance. Not only did Bahia grass's presence in a plot reduce biodiversity, but because we counted how many tillers were in a plot, we can determine a relationship between the number of tillers and biodiversity. And as few as 20 tillers, meaning those little grass clones that come off the stolon, decreased biodiversity totally by 50% and grass diversity by 72%. Those orange zones represent lost biodiversity with only 20 tillers. We were left with only the blue. Our research shows why Bahia grass is a successful invader. If you recall the definition of an invasive species, they achieve landscape spread and cause ecological or environmental harm. We see that Bahia grass reduces the number of species and is frequent on the landscape, even when it hasn't necessarily been planted. Bahia grass is a bred invader, a man-made monster, but our second example is introduced by accident and transforms ecosystems to fit its preference. The poster child for invasive species, cheatgrass is among one of the most studied species invasions because of its ability to completely transform landscapes. Cheatgrass is a non-native species introduced from Eurasia as a contaminant in hay, making it a sort of ecological hitchhiker. It can cause complete landscape conversion from shrubland to grassland, and it does this by changing the frequency of fire. This grass is most problematic in the Great Basin ecosystem. Many of you may live near or in the Great Basin, but here is a map for reference. The vegetation and the ecosystem of the Great Basin looks like this. This is native sagebrush steppe. Cheatgrass can turn this into this. Although this occurs mostly in the Great Basin, cheatgrass is also widespread. It's present in all 50 states of the US, and though it may not cause this kind of damage everywhere, it is a widespread and successful invader. So what makes cheatgrass so successful? Cheatgrass is an annual grass, meaning that it grows and dies in a single year, leaving seeds for the next year's generation. The Great Basin ecosystem is vulnerable to invasion by annual grasses. There are not a lot of native annual grasses that can grow as densely as cheatgrass. And if you take a look at the native shrubland, there's a lot of space in between the shrubs. Cheatgrass can take advantage of this empty space and reproduce in this area. In fact, up to 1,400 plants of cheatgrass can squeeze into a square foot, and each individual produces many, many seeds. It germinates early and reliably, and it grows deep roots to access nutrients and water before native plants. Most importantly, though, because cheatgrass is an annual, meaning that it completes its life cycle early in the year, it is dry and crispy by summer. Because these spaces between shrubs, which are historically less populated, are now filled with dry, crispy grass, the probability of fire has changed. And this is how cheatgrass is so successful. It burns. Sagebrush ecosystems evolved with fire returning every 20 to 50 years. Sagebrush, the dominant species, doesn't grow back quickly after fire, and it needs these 20 to 50 years to grow back before the next fire. The grass fire cycle is when a grass, such as cheatgrass, invades an ecosystem. In this case, cheatgrass invades the spaces between shrubs. It gets crispy, fueling fires and increasing the likelihood of large burns. Next spring, cheatgrass resprouts because it's an annual, and it may be able to outcompete the slow-growing shrubs. This repeats, increasing the chance of fire from happening every 20 to 50 years to maybe 5. Shrubs burn, grasses replace them, the likelihood of fire increases, and after fire comes more grass, and a shrubland can become miles and miles of a single annual grass. But we aren't just losing shrubs. Many things call these shrubs home and eat them. We're losing mule deer and sage grouse. We lose songbirds and insects. We lose hydrologic function and healthy stream ecosystems. How do you put a price on an entire ecosystem? Cheatgrass is an example of some of the most drastic instances of species invasion. I've explained these general patterns of invasion, but even without fire, cheatgrass is a tenacious invader. As scientists, we want to look at other factors to see what we may be missing. Now we're getting into my area of research and the data that I'm currently collecting. We know that cheatgrass is more competitive in low elevations and dry regions. Scientists have also shown that cheatgrass may be able to access nutrients that are maybe unavailable to other plants, specifically nitrogen. This is really important because plants need nitrogen to grow. So is cheatgrass stealing nitrogen, or is it maybe able to come up with nitrogen that plants can't access? My research that I'm currently working on proposes a way that cheatgrass modifies its habitat to invade that doesn't necessarily involve fire. We know that cheatgrass is more competitive in low elevations and dry areas. In places like the Great Basin, high elevation often means high moisture, and low elevation often means low moisture. We know that some grasses, when undergoing drought, can cheat the system to get nutrients and outcompete other plants. I'll show you what I mean. Plants need nitrogen to grow, and soil microbes in the soil often need carbon to grow. Plants also need carbon, but they can photosynthesize to make their own carbon, so it's not as a big deal to them. So plants and microbes make a deal. I need nitrogen, and you need carbon. So I will give you some carbon in the form of sugars or amino acids through my roots if you give me nitrogen in return. So how this works is plants release carbon in the form of sugars or amino acids through their roots. The microbes consume the carbon and they excrete nitrogen as a waste product. This nitrogen is then available to the plant so it can grow. So is cheatgrass purchasing nitrogen from microbes to better compete with native plants? We've seen this be triggered by drought in other grass species, so why not cheatgrass? This would explain the unaccounted ability to get nitrogen from the soil, as well as a competitive advantage in low and dry ecosystems. This is my hypothesis that I will begin to test this spring and summer. Dry soil, starting at the bottom, triggers cheatgrass. Dry soil triggers cheatgrass to purchase nutrients from the soil microbes. Access to more nutrients means that it can compete better with native plants, which results in more grass who consume more water, resulting in dry soil that further triggers this need to exchange nutrients with microbes. If this is true, we may be able to better understand why cheatgrass is so successful and take steps towards managing it more effectively. So to quickly review, invasive species, that is, species that are non-native, persistent, and cause economic or environmental harm, are a leading cause of biodiversity loss on a global scale. Grasses are particularly effective invaders because of their economic importance, our need to transport them, and the ability to change the landscape around them. We looked at two examples of invasive grasses, Bahia Grass, a grass selected for traits that make it an excellent invader. Our research identifies it as an emerging invasive species in need of management. And we looked at the infamous cheatgrass, which changes its environment to favor itself. These grasses pose great threats to biodiversity, and we need all the scientists we can get working on this problem. None of us have to come up with 100% of the solution, but if 100 of us come up with a 1% solution, we may find ourselves living in a much greener world. Today I told you about my research with grasses, but as a plant ecologist, I've done some other miscellaneous things that didn't quite fit in this talk, but I would hate to leave them out. Some of my past gigs include flying drones to remotely sense juniper trees, hunting for endangered cacti in the ghost towns of West Texas, mountain climbing in the burn zones of a wildfire, and working in American prairie while catching native bees and wasps with a team of insect ecologists. And of course, I get to look at beautiful and amazing plants all of the time. It's not just me doing this work, so I want to acknowledge my collaborators, my advisors, and my mentors. It takes a village to conduct research, and I want to thank everyone sincerely who has been involved with the research I spoke about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was great, thanks. So I have some questions, and we're going to open this up to audience questions as well. I wanted to just jump off at the end of your talk where you were showing that a plant ecologist can do a lot of different things, including mountain climbing and expeditioning. What has been one of your favorite studies that you've done so far?
Oh, that's such a hard question. Many of the things that I have done have been very fun and unique in their own ways, but I really did enjoy I participated in a brief cactus survey out in Big Bend. I'd never really been in the desert before that. It was right before I had decided to move here. And I just spent a week with some of my good friends who are botanists and plant ecologists, goofing off in the desert looking for endangered cacti, which is very hard on the eyes. And it was just a wonderful time just scanning the desert for these bright pink flowers or these little tiny golf ball cacti. It was really fun. And part of that included, because they grow on limestone, or one of the species does, searching in this ghost town because the limestone formation had gone through the ghost town. It was a really wonderful time.
Neat. And so going into your research, talking about something rare, now talking about something that's a lot more common, I think that it's really fascinating that a grass we might see surrounding our home even, or surrounding the area we live residentially, can be considered invasive and is really doing damage kind of right under our noses. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think with lawn grasses, it's a very similar problem to range grasses. You're in the same boat of selecting for traits that would probably make a grass a potential invader. You're kind of increasing the likelihood. And so, you still want to be able to seed, let's say, Bermuda grass in your lawn once a year, maybe twice a year, and not really have to worry about weeding it. And so you're kind of in the same boat where you're kind of selecting for traits, and it's not just the humans that are growing the lawns, it's the people who are selling the seed, etc. But one way people get around this is by planting native grasses or doing xeric gardens if you live in the high desert or the lower desert. And there's a lot of resources online for how to get started with a native lawn if that's something that you're interested in.
So there's ways that you can plant your own grass that won't then become a problem in the community.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And you're lowering this risk of a non-native, possibly invasive grass escaping. And in fact, that chart that I showed with the most abundant non-native grasses that we found out in East Texas, many of those were lawn grasses. Not all of them were grasses, yeah.
So I'm curious, I know you talked a little bit about how the Bahia grass is so thick that it can kind of starve out the other grasses. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that works? Is it just because it covers the earth so thickly, or is it robbing nutrients from the soil, or can you tell us more?
Yeah, I think, well, part of it is that these grasses, specifically Bahia grass, has been bred over time to really be effective at being the only grass that's in a given area. And so when you look up the fact sheets in the agricultural stations, the people who breed the grass, they're saying, oh, well, we've selected this new strain of this grass that's really effective, and it's cold tolerant, it's resistant to bugs, and it's really large. And so that's good because it feeds your cattle more, and also you have to seed it less. And so from what I've seen, it's kind of hard to get at this mechanism, but I have seen, I did mention this one instance where I've literally seen it kind of tillering over another grass and then kind of cutting down into the soil. And so I do think that part of it is that it is just competitive. It can grow over things and continue to grow roots down. And then I think also that once it's there, once it's established, it's really hard to kind of get in between those really thick stolons. And so I think it's a war of attrition almost. And so.
And so on the other end of the research, once we figured out what these grasses are doing, do you have any sense of what the solution might be to decrease their presence and restore native species?
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem. There's a lot of literature that says that once you are able to kind of, in the case of Bahia grass, we kind of just went out and we're like, what are we seeing? And we kind of didn't expect to necessarily see Bahia grass out there. And so a lot of evidence shows that once you're able to kind of see it in the landscape, it may already be a little bit too late to go turn back the clock and say, no, we have to prevent this. Eradication is much more difficult. So you have to many people say maybe it's better to focus on managing it as part of the community and trying to get it as low numbers as possible, with the understanding that maybe eradication will be very difficult. And so with Bahia grass, I think the first step would be to stop actively planting. It's sold across Texas as a forage grass still. And then maybe moving forward towards management steps. With grasses that completely change the way an ecosystem works, such as cheatgrass, it's much more difficult to get at a solution. And so that's why we kind of I think it's important to attack it at multiple angles. Is there a below ground feedback that's contributing to this? Is it possible that we can maybe use competitive advantage of native forbs? How can we give them an advantage, native forbs and grasses, to be able to maybe better take nutrients that cheatgrass may be taking, building a more resilient ecosystem?
And I know that the fact that the cheatgrass seeds so readily every year is probably an added problem to the population of the grass. Have you thought at all about that?
Yeah, that is a difficult problem. Some people, I know that there's some people out there working on like pathogens, because there is this concept that maybe cheatgrass is also kind of released from predators and pathogens where it is. And so I know there's some people who are working on biocontrol. The seeding is not something I have necessarily looked at. I am very interested in this below ground feedback and how maybe is cheatgrass kind of swinging the ecosystem in its favor in multiple ways. And how can we maybe look at this kind of below ground mechanism and kind of see what's going on, and then maybe change the way this mechanism works to swing it back in the advantage of native plants.
Mm-hmm. We have an interesting question from an audience member here asking whether the phenology of grasses can change as they spread.
Changes across latitudes. Yeah, this is definitely something that does occur. And I'm sure that this, I'm not positive, this is not an area of my expertise, but I know that phenology of cheatgrass is not only like an important mechanism by which it invades. It germinates early, which means it has early access to resources. But it's possible that that can change on an elevational or latitudinal gradient as well. That would be a very interesting question. In this second part that I mentioned, I'm looking at how moisture and moisture and these different nitrogen regimes can influence cheatgrass invasion. And so it might be interesting in this experiment, I am separating moisture from elevation. And it might be interesting to see, you know, is this really maybe doing an observational study? Is this something that changes with elevation, with latitude? This is an interesting question. And unfortunately, I don't have the tools to answer it off the top of my head, but it would be a wonderful thing to look at.
Yeah, definitely inspiration for future research.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering, as a scientist, kind of some inspiration for the students watching. Before the broadcast, you mentioned that you always pictured maybe you would study plants, but you thought maybe trees, or never really expected it to be grasses. How did you hone in on this specific focus going through your educational career and figure out that this is what you wanted to study?
Yeah, well, I originally went to college to be an engineer. And then I realized that maybe that wasn't the best fit for me. So I kind of was like, well, I do love biology and I do love plants. I really enjoy looking at them. So maybe I'll like join a biology program. So I joined this environmental science program, and they do make you do research, at least just a little bit, to kind of see what is out there. And I joined the insect ecology lab where I was catching insects. And I joined as a plant ecologist. I was identifying plants, and I was identifying all of these beautiful wildflowers and little tiny like itty bitty flowers. And I just really loved the different life history of the herbaceous plants and flowering plants, like the really showy group of plants. And then, so I was like, oh, I'll join a plant ecology lab. And I joined this plant ecology lab, and they were like, we study mostly grasses. And I was like, well, you can't catch me. I will be studying forbs in this lab. Like, I'll study the flowers. And what turned out is that, you know, I love these flowering plants. I think they're beautiful. I think they're charming. But these grasses pose a pretty interesting threat to these. And I just, even though maybe I wasn't necessarily attracted to grasses as an organism, this problem is very interesting to me as a scientist. And it threatens something that I love dearly. And so I kind of just, as my advice to a young scientist would be to kind of follow what interests you and not really worry about like maybe the aesthetic value, or to give things an opportunity to be interesting. Because I almost discounted grass and was like, oh, well, you can't catch me studying grass. They're kind of boring. But then once I opened, you know, let myself be open to this very interesting problem of grass invasion and how grasses change their ecosystem and swing things in their favor, I still get to look at forbs and flowering plants all of the time. However, I'm studying this very interesting problem of grasses. So.
Well, there you have it. Wise words from a PhD student to follow your interest and see where it takes you. I love that. So Katie Strain, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. We're going to wrap up, but if you have any other questions, you feel free to comment them on our social media, and we'll make sure that we get them to Katie. And thank you so much. I appreciate you giving a presentation today.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.